Good morning. I'm Rollie Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And this morning, we're going to be talking about semiconductors. And FPRI just published a really terrific report called Labs over Fabs, How the U.S. Should Invest in the Future of Semiconductors. And it is authored by Chris Miller, who is the FPRI's Eurasia Program Director, Jordan Schneider and Danny Crichton, and they are all with you here today to discuss this topic and why semiconductors matter to, or if they matter to, U.S. foreign policy. Before we get started, I'd very much like to say thank you to the Korea Foundation, who made this work possible, and also say thank you to our supporters and our members who also make FPRI possible. And I always say it, and I'm a broken record, but these events are free to the public. Our publications are free to the public, but they're not free to us. So please, if you enjoy this program, if you learn something from this program, remember us and make a contribution. Let me talk a little bit about our guests this morning, but before I do that, I want to point you to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, because we will be taking questions, may even be weaving them into the discussion as we go along. Use the Q&A box because we don't always pay attention to the chat box. The chat box, you will have a link to this report. And if any locations come up where a map seems to be appropriate, we'll put a link to a map in there too as we go along. So let me introduce our panel first. Chris Miller, whom many of you know, as I mentioned, is the director of FPRI's Eurasia program. He's also assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. His most recent book is Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. He's also the author of The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Mikhail Gorbachev and the Collapse of the USSR, which was published in 2016. We have us with us here today. We also have Jordan Schneider, who was the founder of the China Talk podcast and newsletter, and his current position is senior research analyst at the Rhodium Group. He previously worked for, and I'm going to get this wrong, Kwashu, Bridgewater, and the Eurasia Group. We have Danny Crichton, also an author who's the managing editor at TechCrunch, and he covers technology and power at TechCrunch. He was a foreign correspondent based in Seoul, Korea, as well as a venture capitalist, and he was a Fulbright scholar in South Korea. I think that's it. We've covered the housekeeping notes. So again, put your questions, and I'm going to kick this off by asking, I'll turn it to Chris, what's a semiconductor and why do we care? Why is it important to foreign policy?
That's a great question to start with, Rollie, and it's a big question. It's probably true that most goods that are produced by our economy don't have that much foreign policy relevance. So it is worth asking, why are we talking about this one? And I think there are a couple of reasons why it matters. But first off, what is a semiconductor? Most semiconductors are more commonly known as computer chips. But today, when almost everything that we buy comes with a little bit of computing power, semiconductors are in everything, from cars to dishwashers, to iPhones, to computers, to the data centers that power the internet and the cloud. Almost everything we buy today relies in some fashion on semiconductors. They provide the computing power that makes all these devices possible. And because they're so fundamental to so many different types of devices, they have a outsized economic impact, but also we've come to realize over the past couple of years an outsized geopolitical impact. Most semiconductors are designed today by firms in the United States, but a key trend over the past couple of decades has been the offshoring of production of semiconductors, especially to East Asia. And so today, the most advanced semiconductors in the world, which power things like iPhones, are produced in either Taiwan or in South Korea. And so although the semiconductor industry is globalized and the US plays an absolutely central role in several key nodes of the industry, we can't today produce most of our high-tech goods without production in Taiwan and South Korea. And especially for Taiwan, given US-China tensions increasing, this creates a serious potential vulnerability. On top of that, I'll add that China is, of course, well aware that it's reliant on foreign semiconductors. Semiconductors are the good that it spends the most money importing, and it spends more money importing semiconductors than it does importing oil. And so China realizes that it's potentially vulnerable to cutoffs of semiconductors. And indeed, over the past couple of years, the US government has cut off specific Chinese firms from accessing US semiconductor technology, which amounts to a de facto ban on these companies from buying chips. And so, for example, when the US wanted to pressure Huawei, a Chinese telecom company, it did so by prohibiting them from producing chips at the most advanced fabrication facilities in the world in Taiwan. And because of the US commercial position in this industry, the US is able to do that. So China knows any Chinese company can be basically shut down from its ability to access advanced chips by a decision of the US government. This gives the US government extraordinary power. It makes China extraordinarily vulnerable. And as a result, it has placed computer chips at the center of US-China relations and the intensifying geopolitical competition. So although we don't normally think about chips, they're tiny devices embedded in electronics that we buy. And in fact, if you want to understand the economic or the political relationship between the US and China, or the US and East Asia more generally, we've got to think seriously about semiconductors.
Thanks, Chris. Great answer. Danny, let's talk a little bit about the industry itself. And you argue in the report that chip engineers and software engineers are really the labor market, and that large tech companies like Google and Facebook are actually pulling chip technology talent away from the semiconductor companies. Aren't these different labor markets, though, or do they really affect each other?
Absolutely, Rollie, thank you so much. And I would say one of the major goals for this report was to emphasize labor markets over a lot of the language you've seen in a lot of other policy reports. Ultimately, in technology and innovation, the people who actually build these technologies, who go to the frontiers and find the next generation of technologies, that's where the action is. And so you have to look at where the people are and where they're coming from. What we've seen over the last couple of decades, if you look back in the 1960s, software engineers and hardware engineers were essentially one thing. They were not separate degree programs. They were based at a couple of major universities like the University of California, Berkeley, Stanford, MIT, Pittsburgh. And the market was quite small, as you can imagine. But over time, those two markets have diverged. Today in the United States, there are more than 1.5 million software engineers and only roughly about 70,000 computer chip engineers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Furthermore, the entry point, and this is something that we really emphasize in the report, the entry point into each of these markets is very different. To do a chip design today requires a master's degree, potentially a PhD, multiple years of apprenticing at a company just to get started in the chip industry. Meanwhile, in software, we see high school graduates drop out, college graduates going to boot camps. You can go and get a master's and PhD, although the numbers haven't actually increased all that much over the last 10 or 20 years. And so we see vastly different ways to enter these two markets. The challenge is that 6 of the 10 largest companies in the United States are software companies, companies like Google, Facebook, Netflix, the list goes on. And so as those companies have had a lot of financial success, they've raised wages for software engineers. The entry-level salary out of a top university today in computer science is somewhere in the range of $150,000 to $200,000 a year. That is actually still above the median for a chip designer coming out of a master's or PhD program in the United States today. And so one of the challenges is for a lot of chip designers, folks who would want to build chips in the United States, oftentimes they have offers from a chip company and a software company that has a more competitive salary, a better lifestyle, a better work-life balance, et cetera. And so one of the things we really emphasize in this report is we have to improve the labor market specifically for chips, with the knowledge that a lot of chip designers have fungibility in their career. They can move from one market to the other.
So how do you do that?
I think this gets into some of our policy recommendations, but I think first and foremost, salaries is one of the key differentiators, I think, between these two markets. You see in the chip industry, first is far more competitive in many ways than, we obviously talk about monopolies a lot in DC, and I don't know if that's part of FPRI's research. But Google, Facebook, Microsoft are some of the largest companies in the world. They're very profitable. They're able to fund a lot of their workers quite heavily. You go over to the chip industry, and while there are maybe more narrow monopolies in certain categories where there's a dominant producer or designer, the reality is they don't have quite the margin structure to compete. And so in our view, one of the options is to look at tax credits, similar potentially to sort of the PPP program we just saw over the last year in the Coronavirus Recovery Act, but to look at ways to actually buttress the salaries for chip designers so that their total compensation is more in line with the job offers they actually see in the marketplace.
Thanks, Danny. Jordan, one of the acronyms, I learned a new one from you guys, RISC-V, which if you just hear it, you won't know how it's spelled. It's spelled RISC-V. What is that, and why should anyone in policy care about what it is?
Thanks, Rollie. I do have the most technical part on this paper, but I will do my best to give you the answer to that of why RISC-V should be up there with your favorite new and exciting acronyms. So RISC-V is an ISA, an instruction set architecture. You might have heard of x86. Which is Intel's instruction set architecture, which powers basically any laptop or desktop you've ever bought. ARM is another instruction set architecture, which is in almost every phone you've bought, smartphone you bought over the past 10 years. And these two things, x86 and ARM, comprise a monopoly over this instruction set architecture. And you need to, if you're going to design a chip, you basically need to pay Intel or ARM tens of millions of dollars in order to get the license to use their technology to build the chip you want to make. So the promise of RISC-V is that RISC-V, which is another ISA, which is open source, sort of like Linux or Kubernetes, two open source softwares which have been able to really help revolutionize software development and allow the sort of high schoolers and college grads, which Danny was talking about, to do really cutting edge work, because there aren't necessarily barriers set up by companies who have sort of soft monopolies and are able to charge tens of millions of dollars in order to create in order to sort of like work on the leading edge. Is the vision of RISC-V is to be able to bring to dramatically lessen the level of experience as well as the cost involved in making a new chip, potentially cutting it down from $100 million maybe to 10 or 20 million, depending on how fancy you want your chip to be and how many engineers you're going to need. So the hope is that this will sort of launch launch 10,000, launch a whole new generation of chip startups, because right now many the cost of designing chips is really prohibitive for all but the largest companies in the world. VCs are scared of companies that have to design chips, because ponying up $100 million for a product that you can't even sort of iterate on or test yet is a really scary proposition. So RISC-V, in short, is an open source path to dramatically reduce the cost of chip design.
Jordan, my question is that going to be good or bad for the US? Won't it create a lot more competitors?
Yeah, so my sense in this is that it's not necessarily something that the US can stop. And if that's the case, it's better to embrace the change as opposed to sort of fight it and live in a paradigm which may end up going away in the near future. So it is true that many Chinese firms are very excited about the possibility of RISC-V coming onto the playing field, allowing them to save money save money on the check that they currently have to cut to Intel and ARM. At the same time, there are also a lot of American firms and American startups, and not just Americans, but Indian chip designers, folks from all over the world who see real promise in in the rise of risk five. So my quick and dirty takeaway is that it's better to sort of lead on this technology rather than allow Chinese or other designers around the world to start to push it forward, as well as keeping in mind that there are many other parts of the technology stack of semiconductors which are not going to be open sourced anytime soon, because the technological challenges to make, for example, EDA tools a reality is way more difficult and will be way more expensive than the path that RISC-V seems to be on. So even if you embrace RISC-V, you're still not giving away some of the choke points that Chris alluded to in the beginning, which allowed the U.S. to really ruin Huawei's day.
Thanks, Jordan. Chris, can you talk a little bit about the state of the semiconductor industry, but also does Biden's infrastructure plan affect this industry? Isn't part of the plan is to onshore a lot of this production and the greater supply chain?
That's right, Rollie. And if you look at the industry, one of the key things to do analytically is to divide it up into different parts. Because as we've alluded to thus far, no single firm produces every step of the semiconductor process. They all rely on others for either buying the silicon wafers or purchasing a license for the software needed to design chips, or buying the extraordinarily specialized machines that are used to create chips, some of which cost over $100 million for a single machine. So there's no single company that is fully independent. But what we have seen over the past couple of decades, as I alluded to, is a shift for fabrication of chips, the manufacturing to take place offshore. And the effect of that has been to reduce U.S. market share of chip production and to make U.S. firms more reliant on buying chips from abroad. Now, this has happened for a very good reason, which is that it's been cheaper to produce chips abroad, in part thanks to foreign countries' subsidization of chips, in part thanks to labor cost differentials and other factors. But the effect has been that the U.S. Used to be the largest producer of chips in the early 1980s. Now it produces, depending on which type of chip you're looking at, only around 10-15% of chips onshore. And this does create some potential vulnerabilities in security terms, and it also produces some of the challenges that Danny alluded to in terms of the labor market. Because if you don't have a big enough ecosystem of workers, it's hard to find people to hire if you wanted to start a new facility, for example. So the Biden administration, and actually even before the Biden administration, the Trump administration as well, were focused on ways to deal with this issue. And one of the big questions that we pose in the report is, what's the right way to think about the problem? A lot of U.S. discussion focuses on the share of chips that are purchased from overseas locations, and there are reasons why that is problematic, especially for the most advanced chips, which we currently rely on a Taiwanese firm, TSMC, to produce. But it doesn't seem to us like that's the only metric that matters, because in fact, there's a much broader semiconductor ecosystem that affects all parts of the supply chain that I mentioned, from the materials to the software to the machines that produce chips. And so the Biden administration right now in Congress is looking in particular at ways to bring manufacturing of the chips themselves back onshore. And there's, we think, some merit to that argument. But when you look at where an individual dollar spent by the government would go the farthest, that's probably not the best place to do it. I'll give you an example as to why. Building a new fab, a manufacturing facility for advanced computer chips can cost up to $20 billion. And so the amount of subsidies that you would need to affect a company's decision about where to build a fab amounts to at least several $billion. That's what it takes to move the needle in a company's decision whether to build in Taiwan or South Korea or the United States. And several $1 billion is a whole lot of money. And when you're looking at some of the issues that Jordan and Danny alluded to, workforce issues, for example, or ways to promote innovation with new instruction set architectures like RISC-V, you don't need $1 billion to make a whole lot of progress on dealing with the issue. And so our argument is that although it's important to think about the question of what share of chips are produced offshore versus onshore, there's also a broader question of how do you support the semiconductor ecosystem, all the different parts of the supply chain and the workers that we need to work in them. And that's where we think there's not been enough discussion of how do you bolster that broader ecosystem. Because if we spend $50 billion, as Biden has proposed to do, on moving fabrication onshore, that would buy 2.5 advanced fabs, which is a substantial amount of production. But that alone isn't going to restore America's position in the broader semiconductor ecosystem. And that's what we think we need to focus on, is not just the specific number of what share of chips are produced onshore versus offshore.
Yeah. Danny, you talked about labor markets. Have you considered immigration policy? Should we be changing our immigration policy to permit more skilled chip engineers, for instance, give them easier ways to come to the United States, or are we already doing that?
We, in many ways, are actually doing that. In the H-1B context, software engineers and chip engineers are among the top categories for those classifications, and in many electrical engineering, chemistry, material science departments, particularly at the graduate level, those departments are oftentimes majority immigrant. So it's not uncommon to find 70 to 80% of an electrical engineering graduate school population comes from overseas, predominantly from India, China, Taiwan, and South Korea. So it's harder to say, what should change. We want to make sure that that continues, so that the best, minds in these fields continue to come to the United States. But it doesn't address, I would call it the domestic pipeline issue. So, I think when you look at particularly Korea, as well as Taiwan, there's so much infrastructure at every level of education to help guide students into these career paths. So I know the South Korean case the best, having spent a couple of years there. From elementary and middle school, you have technical education, there are technical high schools, multiple universities have been built around chips as a core function and an area of research. So KAIST, the Korea Advanced Institute for Science and Technology, Post-Tech, Sungkyunkwan University, which is actually owned by Samsung and actually is funded by one of the top chip designers to actually create the talent it needs to build its company. And so, that's oftentimes the case where folks go through college in Korea, come to the United States through electrical engineering and other kind of chip adjacent fields, and then actually go back. And so I think what we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years is a lot of folks will come oftentimes for a couple of years. Some will take a green card approach and stay locally. Many others will actually go back and work at TSMC and Samsung for economic and family and personal reasons. And so it's always important to be building out, I think, a domestic talent market, because we can't always rely on folks coming here. India is getting more competitive, and if it has a better chip ecosystem over the next 10 or 20 years, will we see a fraction of the folks who are coming overseas today to the United States stay local? Will they go to local universities? If we don't have the strength in our entire pipeline, what does that portend for the United States? So I think it's constantly about reinvesting. We certainly want to keep the borders open so that talent continues to come. Obviously, they're coming because we have a great system, particularly at the post-secondary level, and continue to sort of strengthen the pipeline at all stages.
Yeah, it seems like we don't have the kind of public-private partnerships you see in places like Korea, Japan, even Germany, where the corporations actually, along with the government, fund some of this, this training, secondary school training, for instance.
Well, I think that's right.
Into this.
Well, Rollie, I think that's right. I mean, Korea, again, Sungkyunkwan University is heavily funded by Samsung. Post-Tech, who I went to KAIST, so Post-Tech is sort of the arch enemy, so we'll call them number two, was actually funded by Pohang Steel. So you actually look at the history of a lot of these universities, and it came from the need to learn these industries, to bring knowledge from overseas and domesticate it into the Korean economy. And now they're some of the top universities in the world. I mean, one of the most interesting things going back to Korea last year, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, is KAIST has really become a hub for many other Asian countries now. So you look at the internationalization of KAIST or Post-Tech, and I'm sure the same thing holds true in Taiwan. You're seeing folks from Thailand, engineers from Vietnam, Laos, even Australia, India. Oftentimes they're actually pulling in graduates who may have otherwise gone to the United States in the 1990s, but maybe in the last couple of years look for alternative options.
Yeah, interesting. Jordan, Should we, the US, be worried that so many leading Chinese firms are investing in this architecture, and should be worried for economic competitiveness reasons, national security reasons? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be super worried. I think it's a logical response to the situation that these firms are facing, where they understand that there's the potential for, well, both there's the cost reason of not wanting to pay the fees to Intel and ARM, and then there's the sort of geostrategic one of being worried that the US can squeeze them on this technology. It hasn't actually happened yet with respect to ARM and Intel, but could. Well, actually, sorry, that's not true. Anyway, back up. In sum, I think it's an important indicator. You saw the RISC-V Foundation actually move their headquarters from Berkeley, where the architecture was founded by a couple of professors, to Switzerland as an attempt to try to get around a potential future where the US would put export controls on the technology. I've talked to lawyers who have mixed opinions about whether or not the US could still lock Chinese firms out of RISC-V if the US government really wanted to. So again, because you could probably still cut off access to RISC-V if push comes to shove, and it's going to be something that that's going to develop with or without the Chinese firms. I would rather U.S. industry and the U.S. government be supportive of this effort, as opposed to try to stop, build a dam where it's not going to hold.
Just a quick question, and I don't know if Jordan wants to answer this, or maybe Chris. We have a question from the audience asking, if availability of semiconductors is a national security issue, why do we allow manufacturers to offshore the production of them?
I can try to take that. It's a great question. Historically, when the U.S. first spearheaded the initiation of the semiconductor industry, there wasn't offshore production. But over the past 2 decades, there have been 3 decades, I'd say, there's been a rise of chip firms that only design and rely on contract manufacturers to actually do the production of those chips. And most of the contract manufacturing takes place in East Asia, in Taiwan and South Korea. And over the past decade, the quality of 2 firms in particular, TSMC and Samsung, has overtaken all other contract manufacturers in the world. So if you want to produce the most advanced chip today, you've got to do it either in Taiwan or South Korea. US firms simply can't do it today. And because building a new advanced chip facility costs at least $20 billion and is really extraordinarily complicated to do, you can't just set one up tomorrow. It would take years, if not decades, to begin to replicate that. So the US government has been thinking hard about this issue. The Defense Department is very focused on this issue, but the decision made thus far is that it's better to rely, for example, on Taiwan's TSMC to produce chips that are used in, say, the F-35 fighter, than try to produce them at home, given the extraordinary costs that would be involved and the difficulty that would be involved in replicating Taiwan's production processes. Everyone that you speak to in the Defense Department knows this is a risk, it's a challenge, but the alternative is very expensive and very hard to sustain. So that's been the trade-off that the US faces. Now, as concerns grow about potential for conflict in the Taiwan Straits, this calculus is beginning to change, which is why you've seen both TSMC of Taiwan and Samsung of South Korea announce plans to build more capacity in the United States over the past couple of years. And so we're likely to see both those companies increase their capacity for producing advanced chips on US soil, in large part due to concerns about security issues.
I can follow up. Jordan, do you want to go, or?
Go ahead. Okay.
I'll add a little bit to that. I think it's important to remember the context, 15 years ago when this decision could theoretically be made. Intel was the dominant manufacturer of chips for PCs, which were widely available. There were no iPhones. Your car did not have hundreds of chips in it. Your car was mechanical and was mostly built in Detroit. You look at the amount of devices in our homes that use chips today, whether it's smart speakers or security cameras, None of that existed 15 years ago. And so when policymakers were looking at the world in the mid-2000s, the US was actually in a very good place. Overseas manufacturers couldn't produce this, and fabs did not cost $20 billion 15 years ago. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, I want to say they were low single-digit billions of dollars at that point. And so I think it's important to not sort of question the policies of the past, but look at where the world is today. The typical auto now uses hundreds of chips that are coming from a variety of supply chains, mostly overseas. You have an iPhone or a multiple smart devices on your body probably at all times. Your home has multiple devices. And then I spent a lot of time in the infrastructure space in the last couple of months, and you look at every power antenna, every part of the wireless grid that covers the United States. Every single one of these has dozens of chips to monitor it for temperature, for wildfires, for power outages, and more. And so the world has just vastly changed, and that means that policy has to adapt with it.
Yeah. Thanks, Danny. We have a question about the U.S. patents system, and which has been, according to this questioner, systematically weakened by concerted action between foreign states, specifically China, and large multinational companies, which has resulted in court decisions that have removed important technologies from patentability. In computer technology, software, artificial intelligence, and fundamental semiconductor elements have been ruled unpatentable. How should Congress respond to this to strengthen the U.S. semiconductor future? I don't know who wants to talk about that. Again, this gets into policy.
I can if no one else wants to talk about it.
Okay.
I'm hearing it. What's interesting about the difference between hardware engineering and software engineering is actually how much importance are important to hardware, but not software. While large tech companies, patent tens of thousands of things in the software world, the reality is there are not a large number of lawsuits over software patents. It's actually hard to prove that you don't have prior art in many of these contexts. It's hard to prove innovation in the software context. And the Supreme Court has upheld that mathematical algorithms cannot be patented. And there's a lot of questions around whether software code, ultimately is an algorithm, and therefore how much you can actually patent there. When you get into hardware, I would say obviously patents are important, but when we talk to, several dozen industry experts in this field, and one of the things they emphasize is trade secrets. It's not just enough to have the patent or the technology or just the fab equipment itself. It's actually the skill of the labor, the folks who are actually producing on the process lines to drive yields as high as possible. TSMC is competitive both because they have the technology, but they also have the skill to produce chips at the price point that they offer. And that skill is not something that's really transmittable, elsewhere easily. And so while the patent system, I think, is crucially important, obviously there was a major Supreme Court decision earlier this week in the Google v. Oracle decision. Nonetheless, the focus should always go back, I think, to the talent. Who's producing these chips? Do they have the skills they need to be competitive on the international market? Because in both sectors, that's where the competition lies.
I would add one thing to that. Sorry. If I could add one thing, many of the listeners have probably heard of Moore's Law, which was coined by Gordon Moore in 1965, one of the co-founders of Intel. And what he predicted then, which has been more or less borne out in reality, is that we have exponential growth in the number of transistors that you fit on a piece of silicon, which means you've got exponential growth in computing power. And this really differentiates semiconductors from most other industries. In most industries, you get a 3 or 4% improvement in the quality of your product every year. That's seen as pretty good. In semiconductors, we've come to expect a doubling of computing power every couple of years. And so in that context, if you've patented something 4 years ago, it's not really that relevant in many cases because the cutting edge has moved on just so rapidly. And so I think focusing on defending the status quo is fundamentally the wrong mindset.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask was, do patents really matter? How effective are they? And as you say, the technology changes so fast. Plus, there are a lot of smart people out there who are pretty good at stealing the intellectual property or reverse engineering it. So, I sort of wonder. A question, I don't know who wants to take this, maybe Jordan. The authors mentioned in the report that despite the enthusiasm from Chinese firms, the Chinese government has not yet invested significantly in RISC-V. Do they have any speculation as to why? Is it just not on the Chinese government's radar yet? Whoops, Jordan,
This
you're
was sorry. This was a bit of a puzzle for me, and I don't have a great answer yet. My guess is that there are. I mean, it's interesting because the Chinese government is spending actually like over $100 billion in supporting the semiconductor industry in various ways. And to be honest, you know, labs over fabs is really what the Chinese government should be doing. The amount of attention that they've given to trying to create fabrication production as opposed to build up other parts of the industry is really the biggest strategic mistake that we've seen in sort of industrial policy around semiconductors over the past 5 or 10 years, I think. So I think it would be smart for them to start to spend money. Also, you know, there are the Huawei's and the Alibabas and the Tencents of the world are already kind of on the case. So maybe they think that industry can sort of handle this by themselves. But you know, part of the government's support for these sorts of things, you know, for an open source architecture like this, is really leaning on schools to start teaching it in the classrooms, developing competitions and what have you, those sorts of things, to make sure that the electrical engineers in their undergrad, master's, and PhD programs are getting familiarized with RISC-V, so that when they hit the job market, they're able to perform at, they don't have to sort of like relearn the thing all over again, and are able to really hit the ground running. So you've seen that a little bit in the Chinese context with a handful of student competitions and curriculum development and what have you. But it remains a puzzle to me, and I have plenty of news alerts with like RISC-V in China to try to see what's going to happen in this space. So to be continued. Thanks for the question, Carson.
One of the interesting things that you only learn when you do one of these reports is that we actually read into the fact that India has put a lot of focus on RISC-V, that there's a lot of interest both in the government and industry there. And it's an area that actually has not been reported very well, in the press, in the policy world, et cetera. So if we have any India watchers and not China watchers in the audience, I think that's definitely a lead we would have loved to, have some more time to follow up on.
Thanks, Danny. Chris Miller, who is the world's best multitasker, I think, has just informed me that news just broke right before our call started that the Biden administration has slapped some export controls on Chinese firms. Can you talk a little bit about that, Chris?
Well, this actually hit my inbox at 8:58 today, so 2 minutes before the call started, but I figured it was so timely we should discuss it. Some of you might have seen a Washington Post story yesterday about a Chinese aerodynamics lab that is building advanced computers to potentially model how missiles fly. And like every advanced computer in the world, this relies on US chips to produce. And so there was a long-running debate under the Trump administration that continued under the Biden administration about whether to cut off this particular company from access to chips. And I guess this points to a broader dilemma of the US has this extraordinary power to sever any company in the world from accessing computing power, which means it can almost put any company in the world out of business if it wants to. But there's a balance that must be struck between, on the one hand, using this power when necessary, and on the other hand, not using it in such a radical fashion that you sever the world economy and drive China to a conclusion that its only solution is to use its military to get what it wants. And so I thought the news today illustrated that balance in a very stark way, that Chinese are using American chips to model the flight of missiles that would very plausibly be used, for example, if there were a conflict in the Taiwan Straits.
Yeah. We have a question about sort of what is the position of some of the major tech companies in the United States: Qualcomm, Intel, fabrication versus design, analog versus digital. Jordan, is this a question for you?
I'm going to make Danny answer this one.
I am the one who gets the most press releases. I mean, I would say, there is a huge emphasis on fabs. I think the industry over the last couple of years has really come together. You see this with a lot of the trade organizations, some of which we talk to, to really have the government fund the fabrication technology here in the United States. So as those fab prices have increased, you've seen, the multi-tens of billion-dollar price point. The industry has really come around and say we really need subsidies. We really need large government action to basically compete overseas. I believe it was last week, and Chris or Jordan can keep me honest, TSMC announced that they will do a $100 billion capital investment plan in itself to build out new fabs, including, I believe, one in the United States. Intel and other companies, Qualcomm, I believe they're all sort of in this sort of group, have really emphasized that, they, I wouldn't say can't compete, but they really would like to have government support to sort of subsidize the creation of those new fabs domestically, given the fact that those fabs are oftentimes not competitive with overseas fabs. It would not make a lot of economic sense to build. So, much of the industry action over the last couple of years has been focused on, I'd call it that area of expertise. That comes from, Chris, what was the legislation, I want to say a year or two ago, for the defense fund for this?
It was called the CHIPS Act, and it's called
the CHIPS Act, yeah. And a lot of that is actually, some of that is included in the infrastructure bill. So it'll be interesting to see over the next couple of months, which particular subsidies make it through, whether it's fabs, whether it's some of this research. One of our policy recommendations was actually to build more kind of centers of excellence in high schools. I believe that actually made it into the infrastructure. I don't know if it was a direct causal relation, but certainly thinking along the same line. So obviously that bill hasn't passed yet, and we're looking forward to it. But the industry obviously is very aggressive and in DC and trying to get additional support and subsidization to compete internationally.
Yeah, we actually have several questions about this. Why aren't we moving chip production into the United States? Couldn't the entire production operation and personnel be imported from Taiwan into the US? And then, of course, the announcement, I think last week, that Intel is building a facility in Arizona. So why can't we do this? Or why don't companies do this?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think if you watch the new Intel CEO's speech when he was, quarterly call when he was announcing this new big investment, he said pretty explicitly that the reason they have decided to invest $20 billion in this fancy new expansion in Arizona is not because of the $3-4 billion that they're likely to get from the CHIPS Act, but because of secular trends in the industry, the rise of 5G, Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles or what have you, that's really making a rapid, that's really dramatically increasing the demand for high-end chips around the world. The reason SK Hynix has announced a $100 billion over 5-year capital expenditure plan, the same thing with TSMC, is not because the Korean government or the Taiwanese government all of a sudden, in January 2021 decided to pony up, but because they see this industry as something that's growing. So, our fundamental takeaway is that, trying to use the government's power to increase the percentage of global chips that's being created in the US from, 17 to 23 is not going to be give dramatic benefits to the US national security situation or the, economy as a whole. But making sure that the U.S. seizes the commanding heights of the future of the industry by investing in this sort of basic and more applied research and the next generation of startups that are going to be really driving this industry, in the late 2020s and early 2030s, is the right way for the U.S. government to be spending its money.
If I could jump in, I'm sorry, go ahead, Danny.
No, please go, Chris.
Well, I guess there's a historical analogy that I sort of like to apply here, which is if you look at the early stages of the chip industry, the U.S. government was very involved in supporting a number of key electronics firms in the 1950s and 1960s. But if you dig deeper and look at the companies that most relied on government support, they're companies that either no longer exist or simply became defense contractors. So, for example, RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, was hugely involved with Pentagon contracts to create the early transistors and computer chips. Sylvania Electric, a company that no longer exists, played a really major role in the 50s and 60s. Raytheon, which is still a leader in microelectronics, but focused on defense, remained focused on defense in part because it found those defense contracts so lucrative. Whereas if you look at companies like Fairchild Semiconductor, which spurred the creation of the first computer chip and eventually led to the founding of Intel after the founders of Fairchild left. These are companies that benefited from defense sales, but really made it big because they focused relentlessly on the consumer market. And so I think there's reasons we should be, on the one hand, cognizant of the role government can play in supporting the ecosystem, but also wary of over-reliance on the government to spur the next generation of innovation, because what we really need are companies that can, on their own, identify where's the market of the future.
And I'm going to, if I could, I'll add one more thing here. I think we're not used to this fact of, there's two tensions, at the core of chips. On one hand, there's sort of this revolution every year or two. You're constantly, reaching a new edge. The edge expands. You have to go to the new edge. But at the same time, the change in the industry is actually really slow. For decades, Intel was the dominant factor in this place. RISC-V, which we've talked about a lot, was introduced more than a decade ago by Berkeley professors. And we're only talking about it 10, 11 years later. And we're only actually going to see market penetration, assuming it continues, another decade down the line. Some of the fabs that we've heard talked about, the Intel fab, the TSMC fab, they're oftentimes talking about 2028, 2029, when these fabs are going to be fully up and ramped up for production. And so one of the hardest parts, I think, from a policy lens in DC is you want a quick fix. You want to quickly onshore a bunch of this technology. And the reality is, in many ways, this industry works in the period of decades. Investments in research and labs, which is the focus of our report, really germinate 10 or 20 years down the line. And those were the investments that Taiwan and South Korea made 20 years ago. They're the investments that we, I think, missed out on over the last 10, 15 years in the United States. And we have to get back on that track as quickly as possible.
We have a question, and I guess I didn't ask it right, but it's, fabrication versus design. Where's the bottleneck?
I'm sending that to Chris.
I think that there's different types of bottlenecks. So there's right now, the entire global economy faces a shortage of semiconductors, which is in the short term a shortage of fabrication. So there's just not enough capacity at chip fabrication facilities to produce enough semiconductors to put in iPads or cars. And so we've seen car factories shut down. We've seen, just this morning, I saw articles about delays to iPad production because every fab in the world that can produce, especially at the most advanced nodes, are producing at full capacity. So there's a short run bottleneck in chip fabrication that's having an impact on other sectors of the economy. But there are also bottlenecks in terms of foreign policy, which are worth considering. And these are areas where the US has a monopoly on certain sectors of the chip supply chain. So for example, the software tools that are used to design chips, without which it's impossible to design a chip. Those are bottlenecks that the US government control because there are only 3 companies that make chip design software, and they're all based in the US. And so that's a foreign policy bottleneck that the US government can and has used against foreign policy rivals. That's a different bottleneck than, I guess, the one we're seeing headlines about over the past couple of months in terms of the short-term supply issues in things like autos or consumer electronics.
I would add in real quick, the industry has learned, I think, over the last couple of decades to try to avoid the scarcity glut cycle. There have been classic crashes, and Chris is the history expert on our team for this, but the industry has gone through some very, very tough periods where they overexpanded, rapidly increased fabrication, and there just wasn't the demand for those chips. And there were crashes in the DRAM space, there were crashes in x86 after the dot-com bubble, and more. And so the industry has been reticent, I think, in trying to massively scale up. The challenge is that in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been so much demand for chips, so much demand for smartphones globally, so much demand for cars globally, that there really is sort of a secular increase of demand that the industry just wasn't sort of accounting for. And so I think for a lot of companies looking at the market now, they go, there really are going to be multi-billion numbers of folks who are buying smartphones on a regular basis. There are going to be several billion folks buying cars who need chips. There are going to be, thousands of places where smart computers and cloud providers need large numbers of cutting edge chips in order to be successful. And so I think they're willing to do that, but they haven't been over the last couple of years.
One last thing I'll add, Rollie, is I think it's important to keep in perspective just how sort of special and magical the global chips industry is. I mean, achieving, realizing Moore's law over the past 70 years now is an incredible accomplishment. And in the past few decades in particular, is something that I think only could have happened if the rest of the world got in on the game. Had the US decided, we're not going to play ball with the Japans and South Koreas and Taiwans of the world, and not to mention our European friends, we would not have been able to, our lives would not have been able to be improved by the magic that these advances in technology have been able to bring us. So while we keep thinking about, while like what you see on the headlines is, oh, chip shortage, we need to bring chips home and what have you, it's also important to understand that like this is probably the most internationalized industry in the world. That's not going to change. And we should be cognizant of that as you think about structuring policies, which maybe help the US around the edges on sort of like worst case scenarios, like a war in Taiwan or a big earthquake or in that part of the world or what have you. But at the same time, recognizing that the global nature of this industry is not going to go away, and is in fact probably like a good thing for humanity that we have so many smart engineers around the world working on these problems to really improve our lives.
Thanks, Jordan. We have a question. Given Taiwan's position in global chip fabrication, should the US be doing anything different in our US-Taiwan relations, which pretty complex question, really. Chris, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I can try. I don't think it's an easy question to answer. I mean, the Taiwanese right now have, at least for now, an almost monopoly on advanced chip production, although South Korea's Samsung is very close behind them. So in some ways, the US is quite reliant on Taiwan. Of course, in other ways, Taiwan is extraordinarily reliant on the US for its security vis-a-vis China. And so we find ourselves in a sort of uncomfortable symbiotic relationship with Taiwan, and the rest of the world does too, because it's not just the US, it's everyone who relies on Taiwan to produce, for example, chips for their iPhones. It's certainly the case that we've seen US-Taiwan relations over the past couple of years focus on this issue, and now more than ever, given the shortage of chips that we've seen. I think one of the key questions that I would ask if I were in Taiwan is Taiwan better or worse off in security terms if most of Taiwan's chip production happens onshore? And it seems to me there's a case to be made that actually Taiwan is better off if TSMC, the biggest Taiwanese company, continues to move some of its production offshore, whether to the US, or there's also conversation about opening a big facility in Europe. And it seems to me that's something that's worth encouraging, at least diplomatically, because it improves Taiwan's security as well as the security of the US and Europe and other players around the world.
I'll add one more thing to that. Taiwan is going through an historic drought this year, and the chip industry actually uses prodigious amounts of water. So Taiwan, I believe it's the worst drought in 60 years. There's rationing in some parts of Taiwan. Tap water only works a day or two a week, and a lot of the priority has actually been putting water to the chip industry to ensure that the economic jewel of the island continues to function, perhaps at the expense of daily life. And so I think, much to Chris's point, it's not just geopolitical, which obviously gets the most attention in the press and in DC. There's also environmental concerns locally there, reducing the amount of clean water that the chip industry needs, and creating more resilience by having multiple locations, being able to rely on a network of different fab hubs for the nation probably works really quite well.
Thank you. Turning before we do our final lightning round, let's talk about national security. And we have an interesting question in the chat asking whether adversaries can tamper with the critical chips, like for our fighter aircraft. And so how susceptible are they to some sort of supply chain attack or sabotage?
I can do that one, I guess. There are so many ways that the Chinese government, if they want to, can mess with the U.S. With the U.S. military. I mean, we've just hack after hack of You know, everything from SolarWinds to the Outlook, the Microsoft, you know, Office hack. I mean, it's boggles your mind the ways in which through software you can have a lot of fun in other people's systems. So you know, there's been a handful of reporting. I think Bloomberg has gone like back and forth on this story that there's been like something on a chip that was manufactured in China, which is now everywhere in the US. And a lot of people have had some serious pushback on that. I am skeptical, but I think just more broadly, like the issue of cybersecurity is so deep and profound that you don't even necessarily need to, you know, have something baked into the hardware to really ruin an F-35's day. The one thing I will note is that the Defense Department is aware of this. They have the program called the Trusted Fabs Partnership, I believe, where there are certain fab lines in certain fabs around the world, which, you know, everyone gets a clearance and it's kind of locked off from the rest of the organization. So folks are thinking about this. The one thing I will say is, like, the more aggressive that you are in, you know, making sure these chips are trusted and what have you, the more expensive these chips get. So, you know, when you're thinking about shifting the kind of paradigm of having these like incredibly expensive platforms, which you basically can't lose any one of them, like an F-35, towards a more, you know, disposable vision of your acquisition system, where, you know, it's okay if like a handful of drones fall out of the sky if you have 30,000 of them. You know, it's going to be an interesting trade-off to see, you know, to what extent you're really going to want to lean forward on making these like really expensive specialized parts that no one else can use, versus taking more off-the-shelf technology and kind of putting it into weapon systems, which maybe cost, you know, tens, if not, you know, 10 to 100x cheaper than, you know, what you're getting in an incredibly specialized, you know, 1 out of 200 vintage, like an F-35.
If I could add one thing to that, Rollie, very quickly, is that in addition to the cost issue that Jordan mentioned, there's also the quality issue. And because the progresses so rapidly, any consumer who buys a new iPhone has a more advanced computer chip than the Pentagon uses. And that's true for every version of the iPhone. And because, you know, the US uses fighter planes that are 30 or 40 years old, that means the chips inside them, which in the electronics are occasionally upgraded, but they're often using chips that are decades old, and therefore, because the exponential growth in the number of transistors per chip, they're orders of magnitude less powerful than what's currently in your pocket. And so it's not just a question of cost, it's also a question of, if you want to stay at the cutting edge, you've got to be willing to use commercial technology because it's better than defense technology.
Wow. We, alas, have come to the end. What a great conversation. If you and our audience enjoyed this, I encourage you to read the report. It's an excellent report. You just don't get these kinds of conversations anywhere else. So thank you again to our panelists. It was a terrific discussion, and to our supporters and members. And if you're not yet there, please consider becoming a supporter of FPRI. Thank you again, and have a good day.